Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe O'Keefe, and I am Dean of the Lynch School of Education, and it is my great pleasure to be able to welcome all of you here, colleagues from ETS, colleagues from Campion Hall, and from around the university, and especially, as always, it's a pleasure to welcome Al Beaton back to the campus. Welcome, Al. As you all know, Al certainly, before coming to Boston College and while he was here at BC, has had a brilliant scholarly career. The NAEP work he did, the Coleman Report, the TIMS, all of it is such an impressive record of scholarship. And really that's what brings us together tonight to this celebration, to be able to hear some of those issues, to be able to hear the testimony of colleagues about the importance of Al as a scholar, and to be able to think about the issues that Al cared about so much, issues of top-rate scholarship and issues of purpose and meaning for scholars. Certainly, Al, in his published work and in his projects, is without parallel. He also was, in his time here with us, an exacting and exceedingly encouraging mentor of doctoral students, a wonderful combination of two things, being exacting and being encouraging. And certainly a generation of people are carrying on Al's dedication to seeking truth through scholarship. Al also very much known in Campion Hall as a most thoughtful and generous colleague, truly an exemplary citizen of the school. So Al, I speak for everyone here by saying what a delight it is as ever to be honored by your presence. So thank you for being here. I know of one person who's especially honored to be in your presence tonight, Al, and that is Dr. Henry Brown, the Boisi Professor of Education and Public Policy. Dr. Brown has his doctorate from Stanford University, as well as a master's degree, a bachelor's degree from McGill in Montreal. He's a distinguished presidential appointee at Educational Testing Service and served as vice president there from 1990 to 1999. He has published in the areas of mathematical statistics, analysis of large-scale assessment data, test design, expert systems, and assessment technology. He has investigated such issues as the structure of the black-white achievement gap, the relationship between state education policy and state education output, and the effectiveness of charter schools. He is co-winner of the Palmer O. Johnson Award from the American Educational Research Association and a co-winner of the National Council for Measurement and Education Award for outstanding technical contributions to the field of educational measurement. Before going to ETS, Dr. Brown was a faculty member in the statistics department at Princeton University, and we are delighted to welcome him back to a university setting where he will begin his tenure with us here at Boston College this coming January. I have no doubt that Henry will pick up the torch from Al as scholar, as mentor, as colleague, and as exemplary citizen of the Lynch School. I am delighted that this will be the first of many occasions that I will have the pleasure and privilege of introducing Henry Brown. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Henry Brown to his new home on the heights of Boston College. Welcome, Henry.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that lovely introduction. I'm doubly honored to be here this afternoon. First, to have been selected to succeed George in the Boisi Chair in Education and Public Policy. And secondly, to be asked to present this lecture at a celebration of Al Beaton's life and work. I say this not only because of my respect and affection for Al, but also because there is no one who's had a greater impact on my professional life. Back in 1978, I was, as you heard, in the statistics department at Princeton University, and on my way to the University of British Columbia, UBC, when Al cajoled me into giving a seminar at ETS, and then convinced me to abandon my UBC plans and instead take a position across town at ETS, despite my lack of background in testing and education. 2 years later, Al resigned as division director at ETS, and I was asked to succeed him, leading to an 18-year stint in research administration. Then a few years ago, Al must have started suffering pangs of conscience at having diverted me from the groves of academe. And he began talking to me of the wisdom in making a move to BC. I guess the U had dropped out after 25 years. But Al and his colleagues were very convincing, and so here I am. So Al, my family and I are very grateful for all your guidance, and we do have one last question for you. Where are we going next? Well, Al, you have about an hour to think about the answer to that. So let me turn to my talk this afternoon on testing and education policy. Since the publication of A Nation at Risk in 1993, education has become a major focus for both policymakers and the public at large. And in large part, this is due to a general acceptance of the argument that the nation's stock of education capital, as well as the distribution of that capital across classes and subgroups, has profound economic and social consequences. Education issues have also become intertwined with debates about values, and on occasion served as stalking horses for other political agendas. And as a result, education policy making has become much more complicated. One key policy debate revolves around the question, what must be done so that public education is up to the task of educating all children to high levels? Well, not surprisingly, there is a wide range of views and a large number of policy prescriptions. Some focus on improvements to public schools, including curricular reform, stronger school accountability, small schools, school finance reform, alternative teacher licensure, master teacher certificates, teacher pay for performance, and so on. Others focus on alternatives to traditional public schools, charter schools, school vouchers, school privatization, homeschooling, and so on. Now, those who are not fully wedded to their positions do seek evidence as to the comparative effectiveness of different approaches to school reform. Unfortunately, empirical studies are never definitive, and too often in policymaking, ideology trumps evidence, whether that evidence is derived from test data or other sources. When confronted with the findings that test scores, such as from the National Assessment, have remained level, public school advocates respond that public education should be commended, given the increasing diversity of the student population. The contrarian view is that the nation has reaped very modest benefits in return for a very substantial increase in investment. This debate is ongoing and at this juncture, not particularly productive. But I believe that even the strongest supporters of public education would agree that while schools may be doing reasonably well in most locales, in general, they are not meeting the needs of students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Our nation urgently needs to reach some consensus on how best to move forward because we are losing ground even as we maintain the status quo. Let me explain. In 1992, under contract with the Department of Education, ETS conducted the National Adult Literacy Survey, or NALS. This was a national household survey to measure adult literacy along three dimensions: prose, document, and quantitative. The scale for each dimension extended from the lowest levels of functional literacy to the levels one would expect of college graduates, even BC graduates. The assessments comprised real-world scenarios or problems that required the respondent to produce answers to various tasks. For example, read a flyer from a local pizza shop and work out the cost of 2 extra large pizzas with 3 toppings. The sample size for the NALS was sufficiently large that it's possible to obtain a distribution for each literacy dimension at a very fine level of granularity. That is, one could estimate the distribution of prose literacy, for example, for individuals classified simultaneously by race, gender, and age. 2 particular subgroups have been highlighted in the matrices you see in front of you: white women aged 25 on the right, black males aged 21 on the left. Now, very conveniently, the Census Bureau publishes population projections up to 50 years in the future for subgroups also classified simultaneously by age, gender, and race. So it's a relatively simple matter to combine the literacy distributions and the demographic projections to obtain a pretty decent picture of the literacy distributions in the future, under the reasonable assumption that literacy distributions for each combination of age, gender, and race remain approximately constant over the period. And what you see in front of you now is a figure that shows the distributions as they were in 1992, the blue curve, and as they are projected to be in 2030 for adults aged 16 to 65, the basic workforce. The pro scale has been segmented into 5 levels, with level 1 being the lowest and level 5 being the highest. The results are similar for document and quantitative. Now, the consensus is that an individual should score at about level 3 or above to be ready for the world beyond the high school. And yet the typical adult with a high school diploma or a GED, but no further education, falls just below the cut between levels 2 and 3 at about the 270 level. Now, if we think of the literacy distribution as one measure of education capital, the greater the shift to the right, the greater the stock of capital per capita. But in fact, we see a strong shift to the left from 1992 to 2030, the result of differential growth rates among various subgroups in the population, fueled by differences in birth rates and net migration rates. To get an idea of the magnitude of the shift, the percent of the population in level 1 or below grows from 17 to 27, an increase of nearly 60%. Individuals in this group have at best rudimentary functional literacy. They would be typically unable to successfully complete the pizza problem. The proportional increase at the low end will be offset by a proportional decrease in the higher levels 3 and 4. And of course, this is happening just as the forces of globalization in their various forms are making it more difficult for low-skilled adults to earn a living wage. Clearly then, holding our own is not good enough. And as many in this audience are aware, the same warning has been sounded by innumerable commissions, task forces, and panels. The response through the 90s, culminating in No Child Left Behind, or NCLB, has been a public school policy that can be broadly characterized as a combination of standards-based reforms and outcome-based bureaucratic accountability. Testing practice and test use occupy a central place at the intersection of these two approaches, and as such, they've been appropriately subjected to intense scrutiny and found wanting in many respects. This afternoon, I want to take a fresh look at one aspect of testing and education policy, namely the role of tests in school accountability. I'm going to argue that if we wish to enhance the positive contributions of testing, and more generally, if we want accountability to play a more constructive role in school improvement, then we must adopt a systems design perspective, one that recognizes that testing is but one component of a complex, dynamic system. I'm going to begin by placing the issue of testing for school accountability in a somewhat larger context. This will be followed by a brief discussion of NCLB, as well as an analysis of the threats to the integrity and the success of NCLB in promoting higher levels of achievement. I'll then introduce the concept of systemic validity and argue that a systems design perspective can lead to a coherent critique that identifies key leverage points and guide a more strategic allocation of effort and resources. In other words, a successful implementation of a design perspective makes it more likely that school accountability will contribute to achieving real progress towards broad-based improvements in student learning. Let me begin then by elaborating on the term education policy. In general, policy comprises goals, strategy, and means. And this figure presents the 4 main goals of education policy: access, or the opportunity to attend safe, well-equipped schools offering good instruction; quality, the achievement of valued learning outcomes; equity, equal opportunity for access and quality; and then finally, efficiency, the optimal uses of resources. In some cases, progress in achieving one goal can support the attainment of another goal, but in other cases, efforts directed at different goals can come into conflict. For example, if the quality of learning is improved, then failure rates are reduced. There's less need for remediation in subsequent years, all contributing to efficiency. On the other hand, mandating equity of access can, at least in the short run, compromise quality. A classic example is the attempt in California to reduce class size in the early grades across the state, resulting in a mad rush in many districts to find adequate space and good teachers, and resulting, by the way, in reducing the number of students from disadvantaged backgrounds having access to highly qualified teachers. Now, policy strategy is simply the plan for achieving the goals by various means. And the next figure depicts some of the means at the disposal of policymakers. Infrastructure, of course, is just the buildings, furniture, equipment, texts, and so on. Human capital refers to the teachers, the supervisors, school leaders, as well as district and state department staff. regulations and oversight refer to monitoring and governance of the system, and then finally funding, the amount of funds available and their distribution through the system. Accountability is a particular form of oversight and operates through the authority of laws and regulations. Given the importance of education to the nation and the enormous expenditures that supporting public education requires, there's certainly a compelling rationale for employing accountability as a principal agent of governmental oversight. Although the coupling of sanctions to the failure to meet certain performance targets is pretty well taken for granted today, it is not inherent in the concept of accountability. Now, governments do not institute accountability in a general way. They implement a specific system with its own premises, a logic or theory of action, and a particular set of indicators and decision rules. To make this more concrete, let's take the accountability aspects of No Child Left Behind as an example. What are the premises? Well, the premises of No Child Left Behind are that the pace of student learning must be accelerated for all students, and that all students can meet the same high standard. There is substantial slack and presumably many slackers in the system. And finally, since schools are critical to student learning, then evidence of student learning or its absence should tell us something about school quality. The theory of action is to set stretch goals and attach serious consequences to the failure to meet those goals. That the threat of sanctions will focus attention, encourage productive reallocation of resources, and eventually weed out inadequate schools. And finally, that test scores are suitable for use as primary indicators of school quality because they measure important aspects of student learning. And the decision rules, of course, are the adequate yearly progress or AYP regulations that incorporate test scores, the alternatives for students in failing schools, and school sanctions. There's a clear and simple line of reasoning that leads to the use of test scores for school accountability. Let's pause for a moment and consider some of the criteria for judging the appropriateness of employing a particular test in this way. The first set of criteria is concerned with whether the test actually measures relevant aspects of student learning. These criteria include alignment to and coverage of the content standards, item quality, reliability, and degree of exposure. The NCLB guidelines on these issues are vague or non-existent, and so states are pretty much left to their own devices. Not surprisingly, there's wide variation among states in the degree to which their testing programs reasonably meet these criteria. And in fact, many states suffer from one or more of the following problems: incomplete coverage of the standards, poorly worded items, incorrect keys, low reliability, and so on and so on. Now, implicit in the premise of using student test scores for school accountability is the notion of turnabout as fair play. That is, if these scores are used to make decisions about students, then should they also be used to judge the schools the students attend? Unfortunately, this logic, appealing as it is at first blush, is flawed, and turns out that aggregating student scores to evaluate their schools raises a whole host of technical problems that are not yet fully resolved. These problems are only exacerbated when the decision rules incorporating test scores are themselves defective. In the case of NCLB, the AYP rules employ students' current score levels and essentially focus on a single threshold, that is the percentage of students achieving the state standard of proficiency in a given year. Not only does this discard much useful information, but it makes the current school responsible for the entirety of its students' learning trajectories. As you can well appreciate, the concatenation of poor test quality, flawed logic, and defective decision rules can certainly undermine the rhetoric and the promise of the NCLB legislation. Despite these and other concerns, however, there are a number of reasons why policymakers will continue to use test-based accountability, why they find it so attractive. First is the cost and convenience of taking advantage of existing testing infrastructure and essentially repurposing existing and well-established indicators. There's the cost-time lag in using tests in comparison to other indicators. There's the relative ease of communicating test results to various stakeholders. And finally, the power of circumventing local control by imposing top-down testing mandates. These considerations carry enormous weight and surely guarantee that test-based accountability in some form will be with us for a while. Although it's not difficult to identify the many problems with NCLB and its attendant regulations, we also have to recognize that it is a daunting challenge to fashion a high-stakes, outcomes-based accountability system that effectively addresses the many goals and properly respects the even greater number of constraints that shape state and federal policy. In part, that challenge is a reflection of empirical truism that is often referred to as Campbell's law. The more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. Unfortunately, we're all too familiar with the workings of Campbell's law in education. Various strategies for test score inflation, up to and including outright cheating. The surgical adjustment of the composition of the school's student population in advance of test preparation and test administration, and the manipulation of enrollment statistics to enhance high school graduation rates. Of course, Campbell's law does not apply only to education and the social sciences. Its consequences are evident in medicine and business as well. The difficulty of creating good incentive systems is well known to corporate managers and human resource personnel. While there's probably no way to fully nullify the implications of Campbell's law, it is reasonable to ask what sorts of accountability systems are likely to mitigate its worst effects. The accompanying figure is meant to illustrate a schematic of an accountability system with four main strata: foundations, data, indicators, and outputs. The foundations represent the direct points of contact between the accountability system and the education system and the government that provides the funding. The data comprise the multitude of quantitative and qualitative information that is collected across the system. The indicators are the various statistics that are constructed from the data in order to satisfy different reporting requirements. And then finally, the outputs comprise the various communications and decisions that are undertaken on the basis of those indicators. For school accountability, the data from the state test now has a privileged position. It serves as a kind of anchor and correspondingly bears a greater burden of validity. The figure attempts to convey the reality that tests and other data will undergo several transformations before they reach the various stakeholder groups. Needless to say, those transformations can either enhance or degrade the quality and utility of that data. It is equally important to recognize that the test data is determined by the foundation components and how they are or are not employed in setting test specifications, in test development, and in indicator construction. Although it would be instructive to examine each of the foundation components, I'm going to offer just three scenarios, all concerned with the role of performance standards. Suppose, for example, that we have mathematics tests for grades 3 to 8, and that they are constructed to meet stringent test specifications, which in turn are aligned with the content standards for each grade. However, the corresponding performance standards are set by independent panels, and the result is that the proportions of students declared proficient vary widely and inconsistently from grade to grade. For example, in the third grade, it might be 40%, but in the fourth grade, 55%. A naive conclusion is that the fourth grade teachers are doing a much better job than the third grade teachers. That indeed may be the case, but there are many other possible explanations. One is that there is a lack of alignment in the standards across grades, and another is that student retention policies in the third grade may have resulted in a more selective fourth grade cohort. Another example, it is often the case that performance standards and the corresponding cut scores are established well after the tests have been built, and accordingly there's no reason to expect that the test provides sufficient information in the region around the cut score, and consequently the probabilities of misclassification are much too high given the importance of the decisions to be made. And finally, under No Child Left Behind, school results are reported in terms of subgroup results and percent proficient. It is often the case that the difference in percent proficient, say between white students and black students, is often used as a measure of the achievement gap, and its trajectory over time is treated as an indicator of the closing or widening of that gap. This can be very misleading. Even when the means of the distributions of scores for the two groups remain a fixed distance apart, the difference in the percent proficient can appear to be increasing or decreasing depending on the location of the threshold or cut score. There are many other examples, but I trust the point is clear. There can be serious problems with test-based accountability even when the tests satisfy or exceed the usual criteria for quality, so that a focus on test quality alone is too limiting. The notion of consequential validity points us in the right direction, but the structure of the accountability schematic reminds us that to fully appreciate the consequences of test use, and more importantly, to determine what could be done to alter those consequences, we need a broader perspective on outcomes-based accountability from foundations to output. A good starting point is the criterion of systemic validity. It's a term that's been used in the past, but the definition I show here is a little bit broader. We say that education policies are systemically valid if they result in decisions and actions that lead to progress towards one or more intended goals without causing regression with respect to other goals. The rationale for systemic validity is that by definition, all principal education goals are important. If we set in place a high-stakes accountability system that targets only one or two of the goals, then it's likely, if not certain, that responses to the system will result in shortchanging the other goals. This is the ultimate consequence of Campbell's law. For example, as Walt Haney and others have shown, schools can manipulate enrollments to shape the student cohort that sits for a high-stakes test. They can exclude students with disabilities or English language learners. They can expel or suspend students or retain students in earlier grades. To the extent that these policies differentially impact various groups of students, say by race and ethnicity, then in the attempt to improve the appearance of quality, equity, access, and efficiency are all harmed. And what is worse, quality is not improved either. Certainly, this is not what accountability was meant to accomplish. If outcomes-based accountability is to serve the best interests of society, then this analysis argues for the necessity of employing multiple indicators for each of the goals. Happily, this design requirement is consistent with the standards of good testing practice. Those standards proceed from the recognition that any observation or statistic is a fallible measure of its intended target. This is as true for a student's test score as it is for a district's high school graduation rate. Just as a test is a more credible measure than any single item on that test, having multiple indicators, each fallible in their own way, to inform our judgment about student achievement or school efficacy is preferable to a single indicator. Critics of current practice rightly argue that consequential decisions about students or schools should not be made on the basis of a single test score indicator, but rather should incorporate information from many sources. Addressing the technical and practical issues that would arise in responding to these concerns would take us far afield. But I do want to revisit the phrase fallible measure. In the world of testing, the word fallible is typically used to denote the uncertainty inherent in any measurement. That uncertainty is often quantified in terms of variance and usually can be reduced by taking more measurements and averaging the results. But another aspect of fallibility is incompleteness. That is, the measurement, no matter how well done, only captures a part of the intended target or construct. This is referred to as construct underrepresentation and cannot be cured by taking more of the same type of measurements. The problem is illustrated here in the figure where we observe a state official who is trying to find out what is going on inside a school. But he can only peer through different windows or indicators. Each window is dirty to some degree, so he can't get a perfectly clear view from any one of them. And moreover, if he restricts himself to just one or two windows, then no matter how much he cleans them, they can't help him see what's happening in other parts of the school. So the great benefit in having a well-defined set of indicators is that each captures somewhat different aspects of the target, and in combination they provide a more complete picture, one that should serve as a better basis for decisions. Recalling Campbell's law, the insistence on multiple indicators has another equally important consequence. Efforts to increase a particular indicator, for example, the score on a state test, may not result in concomitant increases in other indicators, and thus the overall evaluation may not be much changed. In the extreme, efforts focused on preparing students for the state test may only target incidental aspects of that measure and not contribute at all to performance and other indicators. To the contrary, they take time away from more productive activities and can lead to reduced learning in the absence of other indicators. There's no way to tell that's happening. The skewing of effort can happen at many levels. The use of a single multiple choice test to assess students can encourage teaching strategies that concentrate on the kinds of passages and tasks that are typically found on those tests, shortchanging the development of skills required to understand novels or to write longer essays. Attaching consequences to performance on one or two subjects, as is the case with NCLB, leads to great pressure to reduce attention to other subjects, the so-called narrowing of the curriculum. The concatenation of these strategies can lead to the worst of all possible worlds, one in which students are making little real progress in any subject, hardly a desirable outcome. In my view, the criterion of systemic validity leads naturally to a systems design perspective on accountability. That is, rather than simply cobbling it together from existing components, an accountability system should be built from a blueprint that is shaped by both general design science and the specifics of the education context. We see here two views of design. The anonymous optimist is confident that the job can be done. The pessimists agree, but always worry about worst-case scenarios. Personally, I'm on the side of the optimists because they actually try the impossible. However, the pessimists must be heard, as the next slide makes clear. Fortunately, accountability systems typically don't lead to catastrophic failure. Unfortunately, their failures don't lead to graphic images that grab the public's attention, like the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. But taken together, the pessimistic and optimistic views do provide a conceptual starting point for the design process for accountability systems, no less than for a bridge or a building. Let's begin by sketching out the design process with particular attention to the indicator stratum of the system. Recall that we're trying to maximize the contribution of the accountability system to the achievement of the 4 principal education goals: access, quality, equity, and efficiency. In the discussion of systemic validity, we identified a failure scenario in which asymmetric attention to one goal results in harm to one or more of the others. And we also identified a design feature that could counter that scenario, namely the introduction of multiple indicators for each goal. However, if we consider cost constraints, we recognize that simply implementing a long list of desirable indicators is just not feasible. We must be more judicious in our choices, taking into account such factors as which indicators are already in use, the investment required to develop and maintain new indicators, the statistical relationships among the indicators, and the susceptibility of each indicator to corruption. Other constraints must also come into play: the burden each indicator places on school administrators, on teachers, and on students, the direct or indirect contributions an indicator may make to one or more goals, and the credibility of the indicator to policymakers and the public at large. Obviously, then, the design task can become quite complex, although we've tackled only one component of one stratum, albeit an important one. At the risk of posing an entirely impossible challenge, I maintain that the design task must in some way address the roles of all 4 strata if it is to have a reasonable chance of significant success. Fortunately, there's at least one approach that can lead, at least in principle, to a manageable design process. It involves working backward from the intended impact of the accountability system on each of the goals, through each stratum, all the way back to the foundations. And at each stratum level, design features are proposed and evaluated in light of the objectives, the constraints, and expected threats. The result should be a reasonable first draft design, along with an explicit and credible theory of action. That is, a story that explains how the accountability system will accomplish its objectives. And the credibility of that system plan would rest on the comprehensiveness of the design framework, the logic of the design process followed, theoretical considerations, as well as empirical evidence. This is a pretty tall order, and I don't know of any state that is even moderately far along this track. On the other hand, without an ideal worth striving for, why should we be surprised when we find that we keep tripping over Campbell's law, whether or not we choose to recognize and acknowledge its consequences? This design perspective highlights the fact that if we take outcomes-based accountability seriously, then we can't avoid coming to grips with critical aspects of the education system. Let me offer another illustration. Suppose there's a state that has an excellent collection of content standards and an aligned set of assessments, all approved both by the Fordham Foundation and the American Federation of Teachers. The state has set an interim goal. It calls 80-80 in '08. The goal is that in 2008, 80% of its schools should meet the target of at least 80% of their students in each grade achieving or exceeding the proficiency standards. This is the state's principal education quality indicator. The state observes improvements in the indicator from year to year, and in fact, in 2008, manages to meet the goal. Everyone celebrates. But at the far end of the education pipeline, community college administrators are tracking the percentage of new high school graduates entering their system who require remedial instruction in reading or mathematics. To their disappointment, the percentage remains relatively constant. What's going on? Well, there's no need to suspect wrongdoing here. The explanation can lie simply in how the standards for proficiency were established. Since states are free to set the standards as they see fit, they can set a rather low bar, making it easier for students to clear the bar. The result is an apparent success that is only called into question when a very different quality indicator is brought to the table. There are a number of lessons here. The first is that the essential role of multiple indicators. Despite the rhetoric of high standards, without an external anchor for defining proficiency, under NCLB there are strong disincentives for states to set challenging standards. And the second is that test quality need not be the main culprit. By this, I certainly don't intend to take testing off the hook. Rather, I want to emphasize, again, that the consequences of externally mandated tests are mediated by the characteristics of other components of the accountability system. Defects in any component of that system, particularly if they're coupled with substandard assessment instruments and/or poor system design, invite greater corruption and resistance. I began this afternoon by sounding a note of urgency. We face an ominous future if today's differences in cognitive skills, particularly by race and ethnicity, are allowed to persist. Let me revisit that scenario with three simple figures. The first displays the current distributions of prose literacy by race and ethnicity. 12% of white adults fall in levels 1 or below, while the comparable percentages for blacks and Hispanics are 33 and 49%. It is evident that for the latter two groups, the distribution of prose skills is heavily skewed to the left, the low end of the proficiency scale. The second figure displays for all employed workers the percentage employed in professional, technical, or management occupations as of 1992 by literacy level. And the results are shown in the bottom row for all adults and the top two rows by educational attainment. We note that only 5% of adults in level 1 are in those high-level jobs, but 72% of adults in level 5 occupy those kinds of positions. It should be expected that the percentages increase dramatically with literacy level, as they do. What may be surprising is the pattern of marked increases even within education levels we see for the 2-year degree holders and the 4-year degree holders. Evidently, the labor market values both credentials and skills. The last figure displays the weekly earnings premiums of U.S. workers in selected occupations relative to manufacturing-related occupations. They vary from a premium of 68% on the left to a negative premium of 50% on the right for low-skilled service workers. That translates into an overall ratio of more than 3 to 1. The bottom line, the combination of large skill gaps between groups and the strong links between skill differentials and wage differentials imply very substantial differences in economic security even for the employed. Differences in labor force participation rates by race and ethnicity further exacerbate the problem. The task before us is enormous. We must build capacity in every state with special attention to those schools serving the disadvantaged. At the same time, we must address the economic and social realities of the families and communities from which students are drawn. School accountability can only be a part, though admittedly an important part, of the answer. Over the last 15 years, standards-based reforms and outcomes-based accountability have proven to be two of the more long-lasting and powerful innovations in education policy, though their impact has been decidedly mixed. In the meanwhile, testing issues have become the most visible aspect of the ongoing policy debate around accountability. However, like the tip of the proverbial iceberg, much more lies below the surface than above it. Although improving test quality is essential, I believe that absent a systems design perspective or an approach very much like it, we're likely to continue to suffer the more dire consequences of Campbell's Law, an unproductive diversion of resources, a false sense of accomplishment, and an increase in cynicism on all sides that most harms those who can least afford it. In collaboration with states and districts, we should elaborate an accountability design process and begin to work incrementally toward the development and implementation of accountability systems that support, rather than subvert, the noble intent of leaving no child behind. Thank you. Thank you. I believe we have a few minutes for questions.
We do have time for several questions. The floor is open. The microphone is there.
If there are no questions, there'll be a test on this presentation.
Tell us our progress.
I'll do my best. No questions? Okay. Well, I've given Al a chance to think about an answer to my question, but before I give him the floor, of course, there are several people here who would like to say a few words, but since I have the podium, or the lectern, I guess, I want to say a few words about Al in a more serious vein. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to pay tribute to Al, as all of you do. Al has had a research career, as Joe indicated, that is not only long and distinguished, but unusually varied. He has served in both technical and administrative positions at Harvard, at ETS, and at BC. A scholar of international repute, he is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the Wilcoxon Award from the journal Technometrics and the NCME Award for Outstanding Technical Contributions to Measurement. A review of his CV reveals much that could be extolled, but in the few minutes allotted to me, I'd like to call your attention to 4 particular accomplishments, all of which resonate to this day. The first is Al's pioneering work on matrix operators in statistical analysis. In the early 1960s, when computers were just beginning to make themselves felt in academic work, it was still common to code old-fashioned desktop algorithms into computer code and run them on those mainframes. Al was one of the first to truly capitalize on the new technology, developing algorithms and calculational approaches that took full advantage of mainframe architecture and making it possible to tackle problems that until then had been considered well beyond the horizon. These innovations have had a continuing impact on statistical computing and the progress of scientific research. The second is the work that Al and a few colleagues at ETS carried out under the direction of Jim Coleman for the study of educational opportunity, the so-called Coleman Report, which had enormous political and social repercussions. It can be fairly said that the report was a watershed in quantitative social science. Given the tight timelines and the massive amount of data to be processed, it is likely that only a few places in the country could have done the job in 1966. One was ETS, where Al had begun to put into practice some of his ideas on statistical computing. And as I understand it, the pressure was enormous, and it was not at all clear that at the outset that the job could be done. But it was, and as they say, the rest is history. The third is the 1983 proposal that Al co-authored with Sam Messick and Fred Lord that brought the national assessment to ETS. This was a real tour de force that integrated the latest thinking in psychometrics, sampling theory, educational measurement, and data analysis. It promised to absolutely transform what had been a low-profile educational survey into a state-of-the-art program that would provide information of real value to policymakers and the public. Nearly a quarter of a century later, that promise, the promise of a nation's report card, has certainly been fulfilled. Of equal significance, the NAEP system has served as a model for many of the national and international surveys that have followed. The 1983 proposal was indeed a turning point in the history of large-scale assessment. And in view of today's occasion, it bears mentioning that Al was not just a seminal contributor to the proposal. As technical director of NAEP for 8 years, he took on the task of turning rhetoric into reality. In addition to setting up a new and complex system, there were many unexpected problems that he and his colleagues had to confront, along with ever-escalating demands by NAEP's sponsor, the Department of Education. By the time he retired from ETS, the NAEP operation was well established and continues to thrive to this day. Of course, at BC, Al continued his work in large-scale assessment as study director for TIMSS. The prominent role that results of these studies have had on education policy, nationally and internationally, is due in good part to the credibility attached to their design and implementation, to which Al's contributions have been both broad and deep. Lastly, I want to call your attention to another legacy that Al left to ETS. More than 40 years ago, he started the Office of Data Analysis Research, ODAR, and that small group has grown into 2 centers that fully occupy the Thurstone building on the ETS campus. But what is truly noteworthy is that he established a culture of quality, hiring the best people he could find, encouraging teamwork, training and mentoring the young staff over the years, rewarding them with increased responsibility, and once they exhibited appropriate readiness, ready to cheer them on when they were ready to accept new challenges, at ETS or elsewhere. The culture that Al and that early band of merry analysts established has not only survived, but thrived through several generations. Literally hundreds of individuals have passed through, receiving invaluable education and experience, and then moving on to fulfill their destinies. This is a remarkable institution within an institution that has played a pivotal role in educational measurement. Of course, there's much, much more that could be said, but I'll stop here except to add that Al has bequeathed to ETS and BC, indeed, to the world of educational measurement, a remarkable legacy. Those of us who have been fortunate enough to have been Al's colleagues are the continuing beneficiaries, not only of that legacy, but also of his sensible advice, his warmth and good cheer, and of course, his countless stories. So Al, thanks very much, and all the best in the years to come. George, I'd like you to come up and perhaps say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. No one in the testing community is more deserving of recognition and praise for contributions to the field of measurement than my longtime colleague and dear friend, Al Beaton, the Augustus Long Professor Emeritus here at BC. Al's countless statistical and analytic breakthroughs are legendary and recognized worldwide. Before I begin my necessarily condensed reminiscences of Al's and the highlights of his career, I want to extend a welcome to Boston College and the Boisi Chair to Henry. The search committee recruited a widely recognized scholar whose body of work includes many significant contributions to the fields of measurement and public policy. As his talk today attests, BC is truly blessed by the addition of Henry. Welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Jeff and Noreen Boisi of the class of '69 for endowing the first chair in the history of the School of Education. The creation of the Boisi Chair aided in countless ways students, the school, myself professionally, and made Henry's appointment today possible. Now back to Al. I first laid eyes on Al in the fall of 1960, when as a doctoral student in school administration, that's right, I walked into my first test and measurements class. The instructor from the wrong side of the Charles was Al. Several people have since wondered why Al hadn't done the right thing and then ended my testing career right then and there. Al, at the time, was the director of Harvard's Statistical Laboratory, and he developed a widely used program, certainly in this area, called SLURP, the Statistical Laboratory Utility Regression Package, that eventually morphed into Super SLURP. I just learned last week that the first incarnation of SLURP was named BURP, the Beaton Utility Regression Package. Imagine if they had used Super to modify that. Anyway, our paths crossed again when we were working on our dissertations using the same data set from Bob O'Hara. It was then I met Al's wife, Joan, an accomplished mathematician and artist, for the first time. Before driving back to Worcester, I had many a pleasant and delicious meal at the Beatons. There I also had the privilege of meeting Al's and Joan's two sons, Albert and Douglas. Here's another picture for you from those bygone days. Al driving around Cambridge in his two-seater MG sports car midget. It's true. How to describe Al? To begin with, the quiet, unassuming gentleman from Roslindale is a polymath of Renaissance stature. He is deeply knowledgeable not only about measurement and computers and statistics, but he's also a raconteur of Boston history, politics, and culture. He's an expert about Broadway musicals, the 50s, the 60s, and many, many other things. Whenever I have questions in these areas, or in a host of others, my wife tells me, call Al. He's become my personal Google. Al's always been very proud of his Scottish heritage, and in fact, there was a rumor going around recently that he was going to borrow his brother's tartan and come in a kilt, in the Beaton kilt. Cooler heads prevailed, as I can see. Al's a loyal Boston State Teachers College alum. He, Joan, and the family love to travel and to fish. Al enjoys food. mushy pork, Japanese and Italian, a good steak, preferably from a certain steakhouse in New Jersey, and Jimmy's Harborside. But I digress. We're honoring Al today for his contributions to measurement, and a lot of them have been mentioned already. They're legion. Director of Data Analysis for the Coleman Report, as Henry said. Probably the most important survey ever done in American education. Study Director of TIMS, NAEP, well, he was at ETS, he was Director of Research. Al's research also includes studies of reading and writing proficiency of American students and the SAT decline. He was a consultant to NBC on the election coverage from 1966 to 1978, and more recently, he has been consultant to the World Bank. His technical breakthroughs include bib spiraling, scale anchoring, inferences from random samples, robust regression accuracy, interpretation of correlation coefficients in selection, criterion scaling, the average response metric, and in the field of computer analysis, Henry has given you many of the things that Al has done there. He also developed the F4 statistical system. Sounds better than slurp or burp. Probably does a lot more, too. Astoundingly, Al has a measure of central tendency named after him, the Beedian, which I won't explain any further. It's too good a comp question for you students in the audience. Al has taught at BC, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, Trinity College, Dublin, and in The Hague. Tonight's event, honoring Al's life, work, and measurement is well earned. But his other accomplishments also deserve recognition. Al is a loving and caring husband and father, a mentor and model for his many students, a generous and selfless colleague, and a loyal and dear friend. Thanks, Al. It's been a privilege to know you, work with you, and have had this opportunity to publicly thank you. Keep on trucking, Al.
John Barone from Educational Testing Service is going to share some comments with us. John.
Welcome. Hi, Al. Really didn't prepare anything, but I just had to come up and say something. I first got to work with Al, I guess, on the Coleman Report, and as Al related to me recently, it's been beautiful music ever since, and all the way up through NAEP and even beyond that when he was back at BC. You know, Henry mentioned, and we heard him mention about F4stat and the new statistical methods that Al brought to, well, actually to the world, but especially to ETS. I think when Al joined ETS, it was mostly a tabular mentality. And when he came, he really transformed it into a leader in statistical methods and data analysis. And in fact, you heard about F4stat and some of the algorithms he developed, but they're still in use at ETS today and underlie a lot of the methods and the analysis and the programs at ETS. Even our web-based analyses programs that are developed, for example, the national assessment, and are available on the web today, are based underlying them are Al's algorithms and methods now. Many of us at ETS are just thankful for having known you across all these years and grateful for what you've done for us. And as Henry said, all of us who have passed through are still there, and Henry soon will be a pass-through, are really grateful to you. It's just an honor to be here to acknowledge you and to know you as a mentor, an advisor, and a friend. Thank you, Al.
I would now like to invite some of Al's colleagues from the department to come up and speak, and I would invite anyone who would like to come up and to share some thoughts with us.
Thank you. My name is Archie LaPointe, and I worked with Al for about 15 years at Educational Testing Service. And as I admitted to him when I walked in today, he earned 15 years of my salary, which I've never paid him, and he did that for a good many of us on the National Assessment Project. I've told our grandchildren and our children before that if they're lucky in life, they'll meet 2 or 3 great teachers. All of us in this room have met one great teacher, Al Beaton. And he's a unique human being, as I think you have mentioned, and I recognized Al in some of the words that you mentioned, mentoring and a demanding critic. I think of Al as one of the polymaths that I know, and I don't know any others, but I love that word, and he seems to embody it. And being a friend of Al Beaton has enormous advantages. Consider this picture. On a Metroliner train from Trenton, New Jersey to Washington on a cold December morning, and you're busily ensconced with the New York Times, how many times can you turn to the man next to you and nudge him awake and say, "Al, what's the name of St. Augustine's mother?" And he comes through every time. He also can tell us, and there's no need to ask, the Latin inscription under the cupola at St. Paul's Cathedral to Christopher Wren. So, I also made a little list of all the adjectives that I think come to mind when I think of Al. Humbleness, courage. We went through a series of crises, as all of us do in major projects, and Al was our stalwart, and not only our stalwart, but the problem solver. And inevitably, he came through. He's not only an honest man, he's an honorable one. My policy had always been, when all else fails, tell the truth. But Al always started by telling the truth, and we had to work our way out of situations after that. He is a gentleman and a scholar, and I think the phrase probably was invented to be at your service, Al, because I think it adequately fits you. I was going to say that Al is generous, but I think the word is inadequate, and maybe on this campus it's legitimate to use the word charitable. A few hundred years ago, another statistician, Blaise Pascal, considered the alternatives for eternity, heaven and hell, and he developed this wager, which is a rather crude, I better be good and then I'll go to heaven. That's a better option than not being good and going to hell. Al, I think, has enriched that notion. Al has decided to be charitable, because charity covers a multitude of sins. We know all that. So Al can be charitable and still enjoy the martinis and still get to heaven. Al, it's an honor to know you and to be your friend.
Hi, good evening. My name is Walt Haney. I'm delighted to be here tonight. Welcome to Henry as the new Boisi chairholder. And I'm delighted that Henry had the idea of not just giving the inaugural Boisi lecture under his tenure in that position, but also using this as an occasion to honor Al. I had the good fortune to be Al's next door neighbor in Campion Hall for his whole career at Boston College, and recall many occasions on which I learned a lot just by asking Al a simple question. Usually the discussion would be somewhat circuitous, but eventually he would have a really good answer to my seemingly simple questions, and I would learn a lot from him whenever we talked. Oddly, however, though, these conversations were almost always in the hall or in his office. In more than a decade, I don't recall him ever once coming into my office. People have talked about Al's record as a teacher, as a scholar, contributing mightily to the fields of computing, statistics, assessment. And so I will touch on another aspect of his prowess that's probably not quite so well known, and an estimation problem that, as far as I know, Al has not yet solved, or if he's solved, he has not told us what the solution is. It is his prowess as a fisherman. For at least a decade, there would be a contingent of us from Campion Hall and Ireland occasionally who would go fishing out of Hyannis Harbor. There usually be 6 or 8 of us. We must have done this for at least a decade, maybe a dozen years. Joe would go, Al, George, I don't remember who, Peter used to go too. So must have been altogether hundreds of fishermen hours that we invested in catching stripers and bluefish in the waters between Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. And in all of these hundreds of fishermen hours, it's clear that Al hooked the biggest fish of anyone. Unfortunately, we don't still know exactly how big it was, because this fish took not just the hook and line and sinker, it took the whole pole. But we never had a hooking that rivaled that one, so I thank Al as a dear colleague, a close friend from whom I've learned much, and also as a skilled fisherman. Thank you, Al.
I'm Joe Padula, and also a colleague of Al's here at Boston College. I'll recount a little story that Al may not even remember, going back 30-plus years to when I was working on my dissertation and had proposed a statistical procedure that some people here were not quite sure about. I won't mention who those people were, but they decided that they'd send this off for an external review. I remember feeling like it had gone to the Oracle at Delphi, waiting for a pronouncement on high. And the pronouncement came back, and it was favorable, and all went well, and the rest is history. But the Oracle was none other than Al Beaton. And I didn't know Al at that time. I knew of him, and I certainly knew his reputation. But this Al Beaton fellow was okay in my book at that point. It wasn't until he came here to BC that I got to know him quite well. We shared many a lunch together. We shared many a joke. Al has still got me on his joke list. Keep those coming, Al, because I certainly appreciate a laugh now and again. His career, people have spoken about that, and I won't go over that again. It's his professional career, the contributions to the field are just legendary. What I'd like to acknowledge is that Al is a damn fine person. He is someone who I am happy to count as a friend. I'm delighted that I got to spend the years together here with you as a colleague and as a friend, and I will cherish that friendship forever, Al. Thank you.
Larry Ludlow, chair of the department where Al has been for the last, say, 15 years. It's an honor, pleasure to be here tonight to welcome Henry to us and say thank you to Al. One of my fondest memories over the last 12, 15 years were the personal lunches we shared debating IRT, rightness and wrongness, rightness being Roche, wrongness being 3-parameter. One of the other things I wanted to acknowledge also was his extraordinary contributions as a teacher, researcher, and project director, leading to the real intellectual life and the vitality and really maintaining the life of Ermi over the last 15 years, and I'm extraordinarily appreciative of that and looking forward to continuing that with Henry. Now, there is something that of a more personal nature that was interesting to discover many years ago when I was teaching the General Linear Models course. One of the technical aspects of that is something called a sweep operator. Now, that's what has been referred to a couple of times this evening as a technical matrix contribution in computing. Now, if you're not exactly familiar with operators, let me give you a brief little visual here, because there's a point to this. There's been something missing from the statistical literature for quite some time here. Now, this, as we know, is an addition operator. Add something. Okay. Subtraction operator. Multiplication operator. Square root operator. You get the idea. It's a symbol that says do some action with numbers. Summation operator for a vector or a matrix. A continued product operator. There is no symbol for a sweep operator. I propose the following. The sweep operator. And that's the punchline. It's been a real pleasure for years working with Al, and I regret that he isn't back on campus more than he is. Those were delightful lunches. I learned from them, and it was a real challenge to engage him at the level that he thinks at. So thank you.
I guess Al has some younger admirers also. Me being one of them. Younger me, yeah. Despite my, so I like to think. My name is Eugene Gonzalez, and I'm a graduate of the Ermi program from back in '94. And I believe I was the first graduate student that you had here at Boston College. In terms of like being a, yes? I think so. I guess I learned a lot. I don't have prepared remarks, but I learned a lot. I feel very fortunate to have been able to learn from you, to have been able to attend your classes, to have had you as an advisor in my dissertation, and also to then have been able to use what I learned from you in a specific program like TIMS, which is, we started back in '93, 13 years ago. So I'm just grateful for what happened. And I'm sorry also for, I'm sorry that students to come in next generations won't have the opportunity to learn from you directly. Hopefully they'll learn from, what you wrote, what your legacy, and from new people, that are coming to be here. But I guess part of me feels sorry that they won't have the opportunity to learn directly from you. So I hope we keep in touch in the future. Thank you.
Well, Al, I think now it's your turn.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. It's really, I don't even recognize me after all those speeches. But I am delighted with this event, and I'm trying to think of what to add to it. I want to tell you how lucky I've been over my career. It's really amazing, and there are a few anecdotes that can't get into Avita, which might interest you. First, I suppose it starts my first day as a graduate student at Harvard. I was there with my knees knocking as a just out of Boston State Teachers College, determined to succeed, but a tremendous fear of failure. Well, on my first day at Harvard, I was standing in line, and the lines were terrible in those days before computers. And a fellow named Tom Hilton, Tom, are you here by any chance? No. A fellow named Tom Hilton came up and offered me a job as a research assistant on the teacher education and research study, and at $1 an hour, which seemed really good to me at the time. And he taught me how to use a desk calculator for the first time. And then I learned how to use accounting machines. And it was all just a matter of luck that I was the one chosen in the line. By the end of the year, I had a professor who needed a 50 by 50 correlation matrix. And we sat down and figured this was to be about, say, April or May, that if I worked straight through the summer, I could be done with this job by Labor Day using the factors of the day. And so he did something weird but wonderful, I suppose. He handed me a principle of operations manual for the IBM 650. Now, this is the machine language manual. And he talked the John Hancock Insurance Company into letting me use the machine, 650, between midnight and 8 a.m., 7 days a week and all day Sunday. So there I was with a problem to do. And by God, I did it. It got done on Labor Day. In other words, no difference from if I had done it the hard way. But now I had a program, and I could do it again and again and again. So as it worked out, I began to be in demand, and Harvard wanted a laboratory, a statistical laboratory, to service the social sciences. And here I was, the only guy in town with a program that did have the problems. And so I was fortunate to become the director of the statistical laboratory. There was one little problem the first month, September 1957, that I didn't have a single customer. Now, at Harvard, that is especially horrible because it believes in every tub on its own bottom, meaning everybody had to generate his own revenue. But then I said I was lucky. The next month, I was lucky. I don't think President Eisenhower was, but up went Sputnik. And along up with Sputnik, and suddenly my machine was busy 24 hours a day. We didn't have any room left for students to use it. We didn't have any, we had lines waiting for the machine. So thanks to Sputnik, my laboratory went from a hard failure to a great success. Well, anyway, there were other things I did teach at BC for one semester back then. I had a guy in the class named George Meadows, and he seemed pretty good, so we gave him an A and became friends since then. I also met my wife, Joan there, who was in the applied math department at the time, and worked with Art Dempster. Is Art here by any chance? Haven't seen anybody yet, but as a statistician, he is the one who, I think more than anybody, understood what I was trying to do with those matrix operators. I went from there to ETS, and of course the big event, been mentioned several times, was the Educational Opportunities Survey, which gave me the opportunity to work with Jim Coleman, who is a brilliant sociologist, with John Tukey, who has had a tremendous influence on my life, and John Barone, who was a programmer, a lowly programmer at the time, but has been a major effect in my life that, you know, John and I have a way, he never did what I asked, he always did what I wanted, which was never quite, I could never phrase it right. And he has kept the tradition alive very well at ETS since then. I worked then on a national longitudinal study with Tom Hilton again, and that was the forerunner to the NELS and HS&B longitudinal studies. Then came NAEP, and that gave me a chance to work with Archie on that. And it's just hard to express how we changed NAEP so greatly. It had been within one vote of being canceled as a project by a visiting panel, and we spent an extraordinary amount of money putting together a proposal which was really great, and it transformed NAEP into something that everybody wanted an oar in, and for years after, it's grown and grown, perhaps beyond what it should, but it's been growing ever since. And then when I think back of Harvard, I remember 5 offices I had there, and 4 of them have since been torn down to be parking lots. At ETS, the 5th one was the Lit Tower building. They couldn't tear that down. But the ETS was different because the things I built, not physical buildings, but the divisions and now centers are just thriving, and that's wonderful to see that they are continuing. I should just say that John Tukey, whom I thought must think I was an idiot, asked me to teach at Princeton, and I taught there for 11 years, part-time while I was at ETS. And I worked on the NBC election night project, doing the projections on election night. And one day, a young assistant professor and I were on the project together in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, I think. And we came home. I think I drove, but I'm not sure. I don't remember that for sure. And that's when Henry and I became really acquainted. We knew each other beforehand, but we had a long chance to talk. And I had a chance to convince him that ETS was really a good place to work, and that he, as a research statistician, would be highly valued there. And of course, that has turned out to be true. By the way, I should mention the other people like Al Rogers and Bruce Kaplan who are here were other just wonderful persons in the group there. Finally, coming to BC, well, I like to think of it that things up here, that my teaching at George wasn't quite working, and you see, at ETS, everybody's a true believer, that you believe in tests. And now you get to George was, didn't always believe in Walt. I mean, when I got there, they put me between George and Walt. And these are not only not true believers, these are true infidels in the testing world. But anyway, I think over the years, they certainly have expanded my view of educational measurement and policy and so forth. And I hope I've focused their views somewhat over those years too. Of course, the big thing for me at BC was the TIMS project, which started with myself, Gene Gonzalez, who was a research assistant at the time, and Dana Kelly. And there we were with the project. And just to let you know, it's complications. The data were collected in the countries. They were sent to our data processing center in Hamburg, Germany. From there, they went to Statistics Canada in Ottawa for sampling weights. From there, they went to Australia for scaling, and then they came back to BC for analysis and publication. So it was an immense project. No, I didn't do it all myself. I did what you're supposed to do. Collected the best people I could get and put them on it, and I developed a wonderful staff for Tim's, Anna and Mick, who are still there, and Tim's has blossomed far beyond what I could have measured, could have predicted. Finally, it's a good feeling that mine and George's, because George and I really left in the same day, legacy is not that of leaving parking lots, but we've really left an Army department that's very strong, that there's a very strong faculty. Henry, having you in the Boisi chair is just absolutely wonderful. It keeps the strength and it increases the strength. And we're just delighted to have you there and this department that's going to live on after our retirements. So I think that's what I have to say, and thank you very much. Thank you.